Hi everyone, I'm reading Global Woman by Arlie Hochschild today, and I'm finishing that chapter. I believe it was chapter 8. The chapter was called Filipino Workers in Hong Kong Homes, Household Rules and Relations. So I'll pick up right where I stopped. The most common complaints I heard from domestic workers related to food. Many Filipinas commented on their difficulties using chopsticks and their disgust at the customary communal dish, which everyone dips into, using his or her own chopsticks. Some women continued to use spoons as they had in the Philippines, despite criticism or teasing. Others found it difficult to get used to Chinese food. Elsa described how her stomach turned the first time she saw the way the blood is left in the steamed chicken. Employers, conversely, complained about the smell of Filipino food. The main food-related problem, which I heard repeatedly, concerned quantity. Employers of foreign workers often thought that domestic workers ate too much, sometimes pointing out that Filipinas are, by Hong Kong standards, overweight. Filipinas, conversely, often think that the Chinese are too thin and that their employers eat very little. In most parts of the Philippines, I was told, rice constitutes an important part of every meal. Especially for those who are expected to work hard, 3 solid meals that include rice are considered essential. In Hong Kong, domestic workers are often expected to eat a slice of bread or toast for breakfast, or perhaps a bowl of watery rice cereal. Employers, Filipinos note, are often in a great rush to get to work in the morning. In their amazement, employers sometimes skip breakfast or are satisfied with just a cup of tea or coffee. For lunch, especially if the employer is not at home, a worker may be expected to eat just a bowl of noodles. One woman I met was only given 3 dry packets of instant noodles a day, 1 for each meal. When domestic workers complain to their employers that they need more food, they are sometimes told that they should eat less and lose a bit of weight. By Hong Kong standards, Filipinos may be overweight, but in the Philippines, I was told, it is desirable for a woman to be chubby. Chubbiness, as opposed to obesity, is considered attractive and a sign of good health. Maria and Elsa both noted that when they came to Hong Kong, their complexions suffered and they lost about 15 pounds. Very few women were pleased when they lost weight, and most were very happy to put it on. Putting on weight was reassuring to their families back home, where it was seen as evidence that they were getting along well in Hong Kong. One employer described her worker Rena as much slimmer and more attractive when she first started to work for us. Rena, by contrast, was pleased only when she started regaining the weight she'd lost when she'd lived with her first employer. She had been miserable and anxious and was not allowed to eat what she wanted. Like many others, she associated her weight loss with stress, hard work, lack of food, and an uncaring employer. She felt that her recent weight gain reflected well on her new employer, Mrs. Chin. Kathy complained that Mrs. Leong did not give her enough food, and that what she did give her included overripe fruit and leftovers that no one else wanted. She recalled, "We ate together using chopsticks and no serving spoons. Sometimes the bone of the chicken was all that was left for me. I ate the same food as them, but there wasn't enough. When we went to a restaurant, there were only small bowls, so they ate just a little, not like in the Philippines. There we eat twice the rice, and for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But here they eat just bread. Only 1 piece of bread, and it's okay for them. For me, it's okay, but at least at lunch and in the evening, I need some vitamins and some nutritious food so that I can work. Sometimes we eat just 1 kilo of cabbage and a Hong Kong $5 of pork for a family of 4, fried only because they like fried food, and sometimes just fried eggs for dinner. Not much. It was very strange for me at first, because in the Philippines I never ate like this, because I ate well in my family." The official employment contract specifies that domestic workers should be provided with food free of charge, or, if no food is provided, a food allowance of no less than 300 Hong Kong dollars a month. The contract does not stipulate how much food an employer must provide. Some employers apparently think that if they provide any food at all, they need not provide an allowance. Most workers I spoke to did not receive a food allowance, but those who did received no more than 300 Hong Kong dollars a month. For some, the food allowance was meant to cover meat and vegetables, whereas rice, sugar, tea, soy sauce, and other common ingredients were provided by the employer. For others, 300 Hong Kong dollars was meant to cover everything for the entire month, and most found that it was not enough. As if in recognition of this insufficiency, the Hong Kong Institute advises women that if food allowance is given, use your money to buy your food supplies. Do not complain about buying food with salary received. A small part of your salary can buy more than enough food than one wishes to eat. Food and eating arrangements vary greatly. Some women eat with their employers. More often, they eat separately in the kitchen. Some are permitted to cook their own food, but others, like Acosta, were not allowed to cook Filipino food because members of the employer's family did not like the smell of it. When cooking Chinese food, workers are usually required to follow specific instructions. As Elsa explained, buying the wrong cut of beef or slicing the meat or vegetables the wrong size, shape, or direction for a particular dish sent one of her employers into a rage. For a broccoli and beef dish, the broccoli and the beef are cut in a particular way. For a tomato and beef dish, the meat is sliced in a different way. Some domestic workers assist in preparing the food. They wash, chop, slice, pare, and peel, but leave the actual cooking to the employer. Employers can determine not only what a domestic worker cooks for the family meal, but also what, where, when, and how much a domestic worker eats. Besides hygiene and food, workers often comment on territorial restrictions in the house. Although employers and workers occupy the same household, certain privileged spaces may be off limits to the worker or may be entered only for work. Jane's prospective employers list indicated that although she would be required to clean the living room and dining room, she would not be permitted to relax or eat there. In extreme cases, workers cannot sit or lean on furniture except their own bed and chair. One worker was told to clean the vinyl-covered dining room chairs with rubbing alcohol after she sat on them. Others were chastised for walking in front of the air conditioner or fan because it would blow the domestic worker's air onto the employer. Some domestic workers have their own quarters, often a small windowless bedroom and bathroom, separated from the rest of the flat by the kitchen or a hallway. The servant's bathroom typically has less modern fixtures than the family bathroom. A squat toilet rather than one with a seat, and a shower that drains into a hole in the floor rather than a separate bath or shower stall. If the domestic worker does not have a separate bathroom, the employer often designates certain times for her to use theirs. Many workers are not allowed to keep their things, soap, shampoo, towels, in the family bathroom. In one case, an employer insisted on providing the worker with generic brands of soap and shampoo that could easily be distinguished from the more expensive brands used by the rest of the family. Many domestic workers do not have private rooms. Some, like Kathy, sleep in the family storeroom. Commonly, the servants' quarters, or ama room, in a Hong Kong flat, resembles a large closet. It is frequently without electrical fixtures, and even if the rest of the flat is air-conditioned, often this room is not. In many apartments, there is a separate back door, back stairs, or back elevator that is most accessible from the kitchen and the servants' area. Despite the lack of privacy, some workers consider themselves fortunate to share a bedroom with their employer's children because they are less isolated from the rest of the family, and because the rooms are usually nicer. The bedroom may be small, but is often more comfortable and has better lighting than servants' quarters. Elsa once shared a room with her employer's 2 young daughters while the Chinese cook slept in the servants' quarters near the kitchen. Elsa was pleased with the arrangement because she was not kept at a distance from her employer's family. As she explained, "My room was much better than that of the Chinese cook because I am staying in my employer's vicinity. And you know what? If my employer is watching television and it's English television, they sometimes ask me to watch downstairs with them. And we talk and we make up stories about what we are watching. Or if it is a beauty contest, we rate the contestants, like that." Indeed, Elsa's situation is infinitely better than that of workers who sleep in a hallway or on the kitchen or bathroom floor. Wherever a domestic worker sleeps, her relationship to her employer's space is also distinguished by the fact that, unlike other members of the household, she is not free to come and go as she pleases. In the most extreme, but not uncommon cases, domestic workers may be locked inside the flat or in a room of the house. I met several workers who were locked inside without a key on weekdays when their employers went out. At the mission, I read the files of several workers who were treated similarly. Although many employers say they lock domestic workers in to keep them safe, this is obviously false. Otherwise, workers could lock the door themselves or be given a key. Clearly, this practice has more to do with keeping the worker in the house and curtailing her freedom. Not all domestic workers resent their employer's assertion of control. Linda, a 30-year-old who wore blue jeans and a neatly ironed t-shirt when I met her at a Chater Garden one Sunday, worked for 4 years in Abu Dhabi before coming to Hong Kong in early 1992. She had no complaints about the jobs and employers she had had, and the pay was good in both places. She was happier in Hong Kong because her sister was there. Her Hong Kong employer enforced many strict rules regarding work and dress. Some were written, but most were explained to her verbally. One rule was that she must go to bed at 9:30 and wake up at 6:30. Even if her employers were still awake, she had to be in bed or in her room with the light out at 9:30. On her day off, she had to be home by 8:30. I asked her how she felt about all these rules, and she said, "I tell her, 'Thank you, ma'am.' Asked if she minded the restrictions at all, she replied, 'No, why would I?' I answered that some workers in some similar situations felt they were treated like children. 'No, ma'am, I don't mind,' she explained, 'because my employer is looking out for me like she does her daughter.' Linda eats with her employer's family. As she describes it, they all serve themselves from the main dishes at the center of the table, but her food is placed ahead of time in a small dish next to her bowl. Linda said this special treatment is probably because her employers noted her shock and disgust the first time she ate with them from the communal dish. A more critical observer, however, might wonder if this is another attempt to establish the worker's place as a subordinate member of the household, rather than an expression of concern for her welfare. As James Watson has illustrated, eating from the same pot serves as a symbol of shared identity among members of the same Chinese lineage. Conversely, being served separately may function as a symbol of exclusion. In Hong Kong, as elsewhere, domestic workers often express a desire to be treated like one of the family. But as Mary Romero points out, the family analogy has a coercive side, as it serves to distort working conditions and disguise the exploitative side of the relationship. Many Filipinos express their awareness of the coercive side of the familial analogy with a popular joke. This joke, I was told, is often heard in Statue Square, but I learned it as I chatted with a group of domestic workers at the mission. Two women were comparing work situations. One woman complained of overwork, and the other grumbled about her early curfew. A third woman suddenly cut in and said in a serious tone, "So you're a member of the family too, eh?" The crowd burst out laughing. What I had heard was the punchline of a longer joke so widely known that the punchline was all that was necessary to evoke laughter. The original joke, as it was told to me, goes like this. A Filipino domestic helper arrives in Hong Kong at the home of her new employer. The employer says to her, "We want to treat you as a member of the family." The domestic helper is very happy to hear this. On Sunday, the helper's day off, her employer says to her, "You must work because you leave the house on Sundays, before you leave the house on Sundays because you are a member of the family." And the employer adds, "And you must come home in time to cook dinner for the family." "But sir, ma'am, I would like to eat with my friends today because it is my day off," says the helper. "But you are a member of the family," says her employer, "and because you are a member of the family, you must eat with us." Domestic workers who say they would like to be treated like a member of the family refer to the positive way they are treated by their own families in the Philippines, not, as the joke implies, when the rhetoric of family is purely coercive. Mrs. Leung told Kathy she would treat her like a younger sister and said, "You can treat me as your elder sister, and my husband is your elder brother, and my daughter, you can treat her as your younger sister." As Kathy reflected, it sounded nice, but later I thought they treated me lower than an animal sometimes. It was May, summer, and we had a small dog at that time. My room is very hot, and I have no electric fan. But our dogs have a fan. They bought it for the dog. They all have air conditioning, but in my room I don't even have an electric fan. Domestic workers may share close relationships with certain family members, but some fairly typical conflicts can develop with others. The employer's mother or mother-in-law often does not get along with the domestic worker. Mrs. Chin was considered an ideal employer because she was out all day and had no mother or mother-in-law in the house. A popo was out all day and was a popo at home all day is constantly watching to see that her son is getting his money's worth. The tension in this relationship is reminiscent of the tension that once existed between a Chinese mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. The daughter-in-law, however, now goes to work, and the criticism she once endured over her household duties, her cooking, and her way of raising the children is transferred to the domestic worker. But the situation is different because a domestic worker, unlike a daughter-in-law, lacks the support of a husband, which can help to counterbalance the conflicts his wife might have with his mother. Domestic workers may also bear the brunt of generational conflicts between elderly members of the household and their adult children, who, often because they speak English, are the ones who give instructions to the domestic worker. If an employer goes against his or her parents' wishes and instructs the worker to put less oil, salt, or soy sauce in the cooking, to disallow the children from going outside before they finish their homework, or to do the shopping 3 times a week rather than every day, the popo may direct her dissatisfaction toward the domestic worker. Criticism of the domestic worker, however, does not automatically free the female employer from her mother-in-law's criticism. She may still be held responsible for not having trained, instructed, or disciplined the domestic worker properly. According to many domestic workers, children are also a source of conflict between employers and workers. As one Filipina explained, workers are in a double bind. If a worker loves the children and the children become fond of her, the mother may become jealous and try to undermine the relationship. To put the domestic worker in her place, some mothers, I was told, tell their children that the domestic worker is just your maid. Some parents will not punish their children for hitting, kicking, or verbally abusing the domestic worker. One worker reported, "Children are very impolite because they are the same as their parents. Their parents show them how to treat the Filipinas like their gungyan, literally workers, figuratively servants. So if the parents growl, then the children will growl too." Jealousy on the part of the female employer, I was told by both domestic workers and some Chinese informants, is a common problem. As a Chinese social worker from the Catholic Center explained, employers are often mothers working outside their homes for the first time. They may be insecure leaving the housework and childcare to someone else. When they realize that their children are getting attached to the domestic worker, they sometimes feel that their position in the family is being undermined. especially if the domestic worker is young and attractive. And if the wife is also worried about her husband, the female employer may become jealous or hostile toward the domestic helper. Mrs. Chin says she knows some women who feel jealous or threatened by their domestic workers. She speculates that some uneducated people may feel threatened because they think Filipinas are desperate enough to do anything to come to Hong Kong. They fear their maids want to ensnare whatever ugly husband they might have. As Mrs. Chin points out, there is a popular fear in Hong Kong that, for the economic benefits, foreign domestic workers will go to any length to find a man to marry. In the past, male members of the household entered into sexual relations with mujai and other Chinese domestic workers, and at least among the wealthy and elite, extramarital liaisons were expected. But such relationships were extremely unlikely to result in divorce, and only in rare circumstances would such a liaison disempower the first or primary wife. Chinese wives in Hong Kong today, influenced in part by Western romantic ideals, are far less likely to view their husbands' affairs with nonchalance. Elsa's Chinese employer did not see her as a threat, but she confided in Elsa about her fear that her husband would take a mistress, as her brother's father and uncle all had. Like the domestic workers described by Romero, Elsa was expected to listen and to express sympathy, to do emotional labor for her employer. As Judith Rollins points out, when an employer confides in a domestic worker, it is not necessarily a sign of equality between them. As a member of a different class and social group, a domestic worker may be a safe confidant. Confiding in her, Rollins has written, may, in fact, evidence of the distance in even the closest of these relationships. Employers can feel free to tell domestic secrets they would not share with their family or friends, precisely because the domestic is so far from being socially and psychologically insignificant to the employer. Elsa described listening, nodding, and trying to empathize with her employer, but she never really considered her a friend. When she went to America to arrange her things because the eldest son was going there to study in America, my employer, he was not sleeping in the house, and he was playing a trick on us, both maids. Because one time when we came in the house, I observed that my employer, the male employer, he put out his shoes, pretending that he came back that night. And so me and my cousin were laughing because he mistakenly put two different kinds of shoes. We were laughing because we didn't care if he was staying out. We will not tell our employer. It's not our business, but we kept laughing and laughing. Despite the emotional labor she did for her employer, Elsa managed to maintain some professional distance. Her first commitment was to keeping her job, so she refused to get caught taking sides between her two employers. Belying the egalitarian implications of being like a member of the family, domestic workers are often required to address women employers as ma'am or Mrs. So-and-so. Female employers may refer to themselves or be referred to as mistress. Male employers are often referred to as sir, master, or Mr. So-and-so. Often domestic workers view their male employers as their silent allies, henpecked by their domineering wives. Although most domestic workers receive instructions from and interact exclusively with male employers, or female employers, male employers usually sign their contracts. Most share a sense that their male employers are often neutral in domestic affairs and allow their wives to make decisions regarding domestic work, but many nonetheless sense that the man is more on their side. So as to not incur the wrath or jealousy of the female employer, many workers are careful to avoid, as much as possible, any interaction with the men in the household. Like gender, class can be a source of conflict in Hong Kong homes that employ domestic workers. Employers today may be upwardly mobile or aspiring to be, but most are not among Hong Kong's wealthiest elite. Their middle-class status is often quite recent and may appear precarious to them. In short, the employer's class position may seem uncomfortably close to that of the Filipino domestic workers themselves. Women employers often work as school teachers, bank tellers, shop clerks, or office staff, occupations that some Filipinas held before coming to Hong Kong. One Filipino domestic worker with a degree in education felt that her employer, a school teacher, acted very cool and condescending. In the Philippines, she said her female employer could have been her friend or a teacher at the same school, but in Hong Kong she is my employer and I am just her maid. Other domestic workers, like some of their employers, were until recently housewives who worked in their own homes. Certain conflicts between employers and workers are directly related to the assumed economic inferiority of domestic workers. From the employer's point of view, the problem is that the worker will not accept her inferior status or behave deferentially. In the course of describing more serious complaints, domestic workers who came to the mission for advice often interjected their hurt feelings about employers who shouted, scolded, shook fingers at them, or called them only a maid, just a poor maid, or worse. As one employer bluntly stated, of course Filipinos are poor. Why else would they become maids? Domestic workers often resent such attitudes. After all, if they can receive the wages, food, and lodging stipulated in their contracts, and if they can pay off their recruitment debts and remit a reasonable portion of their salaries home, their families may be quite well off, particularly by Philippine standards. A domestic worker's salary in Hong Kong may be more than that of a doctor, lawyer, or a politician in the Philippines. I talked to Dali and Rosa, two workers who were staying at the mission-sponsored shelter in Kowloon, about the discomfort they felt when their employers labeled them poor. Dali told me that she did not deny it when her employer spoke of how poor she must be in the Philippines, even though the characterization was fake. I don't like arguments and shouting, she explained, but I want to say, in the Philippines I have a lot of land, but you don't even have 1 cup of land. Rosa fumed that her employer generalized about Filipinos on the basis of knowing only Rosa, and even then for only 1 month. I say, I've only been here 1 month and you only know me. Why do you generalize? Why you say that all Filipinos? I say, you know we are not beggars in the Philippines. We are rich in the Philippines, you know. I said to her, before I came here, do you know what my job was in the Philippines? I was a promotions manager in a business in Manila. Some employers are genuinely shocked to discover that the domestic workers come from comfortable families in the Philippines. Such was the case for Rena and Mrs. Chin. Rena's family is in the jewelry business. Before coming to Hong Kong, she worked as an office manager in Manila. Her aunt had just arrived to work as a domestic helper in Hong Kong as well, Rena explained, not because she needs the money, but because she wants to see Hong Kong. When Rena returned from a holiday in the Philippines, she brought a videotape of her brother's wedding to show to Mrs. Chin's family. Mrs. Chin was surprised at the extravagance of the affair. She described it to me. When Rena's brother was married, there was a tremendous feast in the Philippines. I think they may be quite well off in the Philippines. They own a farm with lots of ducks. She showed me photographs and all that. When her brother was married, she went home and brought all these gifts, and when she came back, she brought one of those home movies of the whole wedding. She very unself-consciously, put it on our television and showed it to us. I'm very polite. I sat through the whole thing. And then, my husband was struggling to be very polite and making comments. But my children disappeared to my embarrassment in the middle of the performance. She was obviously quite proud. She wanted to share this experience and all this. I think she's quite well off. I don't see that there's any cause for resentment. She was an office worker in Metro Manila, accounting or something, and made about $500 a month, which was not too bad. Fortunately for Rena, her relationship with Mrs. Chin was a secure one. Mrs. Chin and her husband both came from an elite background. Rena's display did not evoke any sense of class insecurity. If anything, they were amused by what they considered a rather conspicuous display, an attempt to impress them that was more befitting the middle class than of the truly wealthy. Other employers might not have taken it so well. More often, domestic workers are like Dahlia and Rosa. They want to tell their employers a thing or two, that they own land, that they have a house, not just a tiny flat, and that they have maids of their own in the Philippines. But they refrain from doing so because their financial security depends on maintaining the pretense that they are just poor maids. After all, timetables, dress codes, restrictions on the use of space, and special eating arrangements, among other household rules and regulations, do not simply control a domestic worker's labor. They also convey the employer's sense of the domestic worker's inferior position, and they clarify social boundaries between employers and domestic workers. Informal rules of this nature are first imposed within the private domain of the household, but they may also extend to the still more private domain of a domestic worker's body, personality, voice, even her emotions. Through stories like those of Kathy and Jane and Christina, however, we can begin to see that domestic workers do not just passively acquiesce to their employer's demands. As often as not, they carefully weigh their options, devising ways to improve their situations and to leave abusive, controlling employers for better ones. And that is the end of that chapter. Thank you for joining me. Bye.